I often get questions as to why the pros or why other players choose certain gods over others as supports. And that's what we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk about what makes a good support. Why is it, for example, unlikely that we'll ever see Susano in a serious support role, whereas somebody like Nox can be played in there and is played in there on the highest level of play? What separates certain gods from others? Why are Guardians so suited for supporting? And things like that. In order to do that, we will separate the attributes or abilities that are required into 3 different categories: defensive attributes and abilities, hybrid ones, and offensive ones. I will leave a 4th niche here in case I come up with something at the end of the video that could be a filler in between any of these categories, but I feel like I was able to classify all the current support capabilities that there are under those 3 categories. Let's get started with the defensive attributes and abilities. Now, keep in mind, some of these are direct abilities, while others are just stats. They kind of go hand in hand here and can be equally beneficial. Now, the first of all is obviously tankiness. This includes both health as well as any sort of protection, magical protection, physical protection, or damage mitigation that's basically true protection. Furthermore, this also includes any sort of regeneration that you have in between, as that in the end effectively contributes to your tankiness as well. All survivability that you get through tankiness is an incredibly important stat for a support, because supports are typically the frontliners. And when you're a frontliner, then you want to survive as much damage as possible in order to be able to stand in the front. If you're very squishy and you take too much damage, then you're not going to get away with a lot of frontline work and a lot of tanking, which is one of the main points of a support. Now, there are supports that are not by default that tanky, like for example Hell. They often have other means of compensating for it, and they get a lot of tankiness through the items still. So you're still gonna build tanky items in order to do that somewhat frontliney job. In the same sense, there's also the hitbox size. The bigger your hitbox, the easier it is to take shots for your team. So some guards like Khepri, for example, do have a bigger hitbox, which can block off projectiles in some scenarios. Next, there are heals. Now, there are self heals, which will more contribute to your own tankiness, and there are team heals, either for one ally or for multiple. Those can significantly increase the viability of a support if they are sufficiently strong, as heals can really turn a fight around and also give you the potential to fight over and over again. For a support, it's often important that the heal doesn't scale too much with power, as if it does, it doesn't really work too well with typical support items that do not have a lot of power. If the heal scales too well with power and it's the main utility of that god, then it's often better to play that god in another role where he can get power, like especially in mid. Then there are any sorts of shields. This can be either shields for others or shields for yourself. Good examples of the different ways here are Gap, who can shield a single target for a relatively high shield, or Khepri, who gives allies a passive shield over time. And as we already mentioned Gap here, there are also cleanses. Now, cleanses are a very strong support tool, as they can get an ally out of a very bad situation. They're often underrated on lower levels of play, I find. Hell's cleanse or Gap's cleanse are incredibly strong, as they force the enemy to be very cautious with their CC and very calculating in order not to have their best CC getting disrupted by the cleanse right away, for example a Fenrir ultimate. Another very helpful ability for supports are any sorts of buffs regarding protections or any other defensive stats or any sort of sustain. These can in fact be so valuable that they can catapult guards into the meta that would otherwise not be seen there if aura items are too weak. See Hell. Strong permanent or temporary protection buffs can really have a drastic impact on teamfights. They're often not felt as much as an immediate heal, but in the end the effect can basically be stronger by just taking less damage to begin with. Then there are also revives. Now, revives are something very uncommon and a very drastic part of a guard's kit when they have it, which is why only Khepri and SMITE actually has it so far. This mechanic basically reigns supreme over pretty much anything else when it comes to saving an ally, because they can already have messed up and they can still come back. You can still turn something around. There could even be a revive after somebody has already died without putting something on them before. We haven't seen that in SMITE yet though. But talking about Khepri's Revive also does something else, which is another positive effect, another defensive attribute or ability, and that's Displacement. Technically, quite a few guards have Displacement through walls, but the guards that really stand out for Displacement are A. Khepri with his Revive that will bring the ally to his position, and B. Janus, who can teleport you through walls. But why displace or revive someone when you can just make them not take damage in the first place? There's also damage negation. Damage negation is when you either make someone immune to damage or you just take them out completely so they can't get targeted. This, for example, happens in Aphro's ult, but this also somewhat happens in Ganesha's silence, because it negates certain types of damage. For example, Odin cannot burp bump into Ganesha's silence, so the damage gets negated. And then you also have the opposite way, where the ally isn't the one who gets the damage negation, but actually the support himself. And that's the case for Nox, who can go into their allies and not take damage. Which can actually be nice if you're frontliner and you're getting low. You just happen to jump into your other frontliner and just switch places basically, have them take you out of the fight and have them frontline instead. Last but not least, there's also XP, gold or kill share, which we only have on Ganesh so far. Just an interesting mechanic for supports that will further enhance their support playstyle. Not directly something that is useful in combat, but it will still get your team ahead. And that brings us to the next point, the hybrid attributes or abilities. The first one here is the biggest one in SMITE when it comes to these kinds of stuff, something that pretty much any god has, and that's crowd control or disruption. This can range from short slows or disarms or silences up to long cripples or knockups or stuns or whatever. There is a lot of room here, and depending on which crowd control it is, it works very differently and has a different impact, is more offensive or more defensive, but overall all of them can pretty much be used for both. The longer the crowd control, the better. The less effort it takes to use, the better. So if you have to aim certain things first for the crowd control to be hit, it's typically a bit harder. And the more impact it has in terms of size and in terms of strength of the crowd control, the better as well. Then there's the mobility, meaning the disengage and the engage potential. Mobility allows you to get out often through mobility abilities as well, of situations you don't want to be in, where you're just about to die and you just need to get away from the enemies, but also allows you to engage into the enemy team better to, for example, get your crowd control off. Another hybrid attribute is a little more niche, it's global abilities. Now this can be a lot of things. This could be an Athena ult, a Janus ult, a Thor ult, or a Terra ult, and all of these do different things. Many take you or you and your allies across the map. Some will give your allies protections or health or whatever without you being there, but any sort of global ability especially increases the pressure during early game when not everyone is grouped up yet. Super minor hybrid ability are pets, so for example Kuzenbo's Nene Kappa. They do have benefits. They can tank up towers, or they can body block, or they can sometimes stop projectiles, so they're not necessarily terrible. But usually gods that mainly rely on their pets aren't necessarily good supports. Most of those gods just don't have enough outside of that to fit well into the support role. And the last hybrid ability are area modifiers, otherwise known as walls. It's not specifically limited to walls. There are some area modifiers that are not walls. Think, for example, Ganesh's pillars or even Anhur's pillars, for the sake of clearing up that it's not just walls, but generally everything that changes the ground on the map in a way where you either can't get through or you slow down when you go through will have an impact. Nox Silence would in a way be an area modifier as well. That goes hand in hand with another thing, which is area denial. This can also be done through silences, but area denial can often be done through certain high damaging abilities as well that block the enemy from going to a certain point because they would take too much damage if they went through there. And that brings us to the offensive attributes. Don't be fooled here. Just because a support isn't necessarily a damage dealer, it doesn't mean they can't have any offensive attributes or that things like that can't be beneficial. Damage is the first stat here, and damage is something we especially see on Ares, Bacchus, and any warrior support, but currently it doesn't seem to be the most favored support stat there is. This can change with the meta. In some metas, a very damagey aggressive support can be very strong. At the moment, we are more looking for tankier characters that have more ways of surviving. Another very good offensive attribute are buffs or steroids of any sort, especially for your teammates. Think, for example, of Fafnir's 2. Different from protective buffs, these will drastically increase your team's damage in teamfight, can kind of work to counter protective buffs. They will also allow you to burn down structures or objectives quicker, and that can be very beneficial and very strong. Likewise, there are also debuffs that will lower the protection potential of the enemy team in some sort, or just give them some sort of damage over time, but anything like that will somehow increase your team's damage as well. Obviously, crowd control are debuffs of some sort as well, but this specifically refers to all the debuffs that are not crowd control. And last but not least, we're referring back a bit to crowd control, but it's something very specific that I think is important to note here as well, and that is displacement of enemies. This is something that, for example, Xing, Ares, Sobek, and Sylvanus have, or pretty much any guard with some sort of knockback. Being put out of position can be incredibly dangerous for certain guards and can be abused in those situations. There are certain things that cannot quite be fit under any category here, but kind of belong under multiple. If you, for example, think of Fafnir's dragon form, but in the end, all the parts of his kit in that dragon form as well, except for maybe the cooldown resets, are kind of mentioned here, and as such, they don't really need a specific classification, I believe. Now, what you will notice here is that this is a long list of attributes. What you will also notice is that if you look at any Guardian in SMITE, they tick multiple of these boxes. I'm pretty sure any Guardian will have at least 3, if not more, of these attributes in order to have enough effectiveness as a support. If a guard only ticks one of the boxes, then this guard has to have an incredible amount of that. For example, a guard with an insane amount of crowd control maybe doesn't need any of the other stats here, as long as he has enough of that. But if you want to see if a guard is suitable as a support, then you basically have to check back with these attributes, see which ones of those the guard checks, how strong he is in those, and if you think that the amount of different things that guard brings for a supporting role is sufficient to actually play them as a support. So if you have someone like Loki who only ticks the box of crowd control for a single target on a relatively high scale, not any AoE crowd control, no bigger utility outside of that, and all he really has outside of that is some extra escape potential, then you can kind of safely say that that's probably not a good support. Especially when you consider that he relies on his scaling as well, and without any damage items, he's actually not even that damagey. On the other hand, somebody like Nox, who has multiple strong crowd controls, of which one is a big AoE, comes with decent base damage values that directly benefit from being in the front line, see her 3, and also has 40% damage reduction for 5 seconds on her ultimate. On top of the damage that it does, has a much better shot at being a support, as she really can work with the items that are there and bring something to the team. If you play an unconventional support and you, for example, don't have much tankiness, you can always and should always consider to have that replaced somewhere else. So maybe have a tankier jungler or a very tanky solo laner to compensate for the part that you're missing if you want to go for that kind of awkward or strange strategy. Realistically, you can easily make ISO support work as long as your jungle is a secondary frontliner, to give an example here. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this video was interesting, informative, and maybe also a little bit inspiring into trying some new things out. If you enjoyed this and you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out, and it gives you the chance to win some codes in the description down below. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.